Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for coming here. Can I start by saying how very happy I am to have had a lovely couple of days in Malta. Apart from the rain, it is such a beautiful place to come and visit with so many wonderful pieces of architecture and a story at every single corner. And I'm so grateful to have been invited to this event. It's billed as the World of Writing, a creative writing masterclass. And when the organizers first invited me, they said, would I do a masterclass? I said, yes, I'd be happy to. And they said, well, how many people do you like to have in the group? And I said, well, 10 to 15 is normally about the correct number, at which time you can actually sort of get to know everybody and get to sort of the absolute nitty-gritty of writing. Well, as you can see, you are rather more than that. So I have, as Simone just said, have written a completely new speech, which is why I have to have notes in front of me. Normally I talk without them. And also I have no idea how long this is going to go on for. I'm told I have to stop in an hour, so shout at me if I'm getting over. I want to leave at least 10, 15 minutes for questions, so maybe in 45 minutes' time, somebody can let me know that it is time for that. As you've probably guessed by now, I talk very quickly. If I'm talking too fast and you're not able to follow me for either linguistic or whatever reasons, shout at me and I'll try and slow down, although I have a lot to get through. And also, because there are a lot of you, I do have to ask a few questions of you, just so I get an idea of what I should or shouldn't be talking about. For example, how many people in this room have been published? How many published writers? So we have a large number of people who know probably more about writing than I do. That's the first thing to say. And who is here because they are actually literally interested in the sort of, in improving their work, in writing, in selling in books at? Again, that's what this is aimed at. That is exactly what this is about. So I'm glad to see so many hands go up. And just one last question, which is sort of more embarrassing in a way. But can you be honest with you? How many people in this room have not actually read a single book or work written by me? Okay, a few hands going up, including, I noticed, my agent, which is really rather worrying there, but still. Okay, well, I will very, very briefly introduce myself and say that I have written 60 novels in my time. I was going to write a memoir about writing at one stage, and I was going to call it 10 million words, which is how many words I think I have written since the age of 22, when I was published for the very first time. I'm unusual in that I write a great many different genres. I've written crime, I've written horror, I write poetry, I've written theatre, I've written historical novels. The only type of writing I have never done is romance, because as my wife said to me quite recently, how can you write about something you have never experienced? So that's the only area that I haven't actually ever done it, but I have written a great many different things and have been going for a very long time. And for this talk, however, I'm going to focus just on one book, because I think that's the easiest way to try and get you into my head and to talk about the sort of the art and the craft, sort of the work of writing a book. And that is this book here, which I don't know, again, if any of you read. This is a book called Close to Death, as you can see, and it is the sixth book or the fifth book in a series about a detective called Daniel Hawthorne. And I want to talk about how this book came about and how it was written and everything else. But before I start even with that, I want to start asking some basic questions. The first one is, why write? Why do any of us, a number of hands going up in this room, why do people write? Why do they commit themselves to the sort of the endurance of spending half their life, in my case, 40 plus years now, sitting in a room by myself in silence with no company apart from myself, a bottle of whiskey and a dog. The whiskey is for the dog. And I asked myself, what is it that drove me to do this and to be this? Why should anybody bother to write? And also, what makes a successful writer? For example, tomorrow you have a Booker Prize writer coming to this festival to talk about his work. What is the difference between him and me? What is the difference between writing a work of art, which his book undoubtedly is, and a work of popular fiction, which is what I try to write? Should we be driven by the desire to write for money? Is that the reason why we write stories? And all I can say to you is this. I knew when I was 10 years old that I was going to be a writer. There was nothing else for me. There was no plan B. I knew without any doubt in the world. My inspiration, incidentally, was reading Tintin, the books by Hergé, The Adventures of Tintin. And because Tintin is himself a writer, people think he's a detective or an explorer, an adventurer. He is, in fact, a journalist and writes, although in all the books he's only ever seen writing once, Tintin in Russia. He writes briefly, but that is the only time he's ever seen to write. But I read those books and thought, wow, that sounds like a good life. But at the same time, the desire to tell stories, to entertain people, to keep people amused and distracted from all the sort of the horrors of the world around them, that to me was the impetus. And I've always grown up a little bit like an arsonist. An arsonist is happy if he can strike one match and look at the flame. If he sets fire to the lectern, that's even better. Set fire to this entire tent and he begins to enjoy himself. Set fire to the whole of Malta or the entire world. And that is his heart's desire. And that is how it's been for me. The money, fame, celebrity, success, book sales, all that stuff doesn't matter. I just want to keep people amused, and the more people, the better. So that is why I've always written and why I still write to this day. Where do books begin? That's the next question I want to ask you. Where do we start as a writer to do it? And for me, of course, the answer is simple. If I was in a room with just 10 of you, I would ask each and every one of you to come up with, actually, I would ask you anyway, what is the first and most important thing for a writer? Imagination is an important weapon, of course, an important tool. We have to have imagination, although there are writers who write histories, biographies, who write, science books. You don't necessarily need imagination so much as the ability to understand and to communicate. What is it that sets a fiction part to write? What begins for a fiction writer the journey of writing a book, do you think? Sorry? Passion? Yeah, you're doing abstracts. For me, it's one other thing. It's an idea. I heard it over there. The business of the writer like me, is to have ideas. And I have ideas, I would say, at a rate of about 10 a day, maybe 20, 50 a week, because every single thing in the world, to me, has a story attached to it. The person standing there taking a photograph of me at this very moment. Why? Who? What's the photograph for? Where will it be used? Where did she come from this morning? This man in the front row. What is his secret? Why is he here? Is the lady on the right of him his wife, his sister, somebody a complete stranger, somebody he wants to kill? I don't know. These are the things, the connections between all of us. While I've been in Malta, I've had two great ideas, serious ideas, for things that I might write. I'll share them with you. This morning I went to the Cathedral of St. John. What an amazing building. And I was walking around it and I was then told the story of the stolen Caravaggio. And because I write television as well as film, and which is one of the wonderful things incidentally, my wife Jill Green, who is my producer, who makes my TV programs, was standing next to me, and we both had the same idea at the same moment. And as we go out, we're talking about, is there a TV series about the theft of this painting? Or if not the theft of this painting, how about a TV series about the theft of a work of art, a great work of art? Television drama and crime has many, many murders and many different sorts of crime. Has there been one about the theft of a piece of art? And should it be the Caravaggio, or should we make up a piece of art, or do it the Mona Lisa, or whatever? And you begin to think about all the different things that would entail. What sort of thief would steal it? Do they steal it for money, or do they steal it to hold it to ransom? That's an interesting idea. If you don't, actually that's what happened with the Caravaggio, of course. If you don't pay us a certain amount of money, we will torch this piece of work. And who is the detective who is going to investigate this? What sort of policeman or policewoman has that sort of role in life? So that to me already is the beginning of a story. And then there was a second story which I've had since I've been on Malta, which is rather odd. But since I've been here, for reasons I'm not sure quite why, every single taxi I have got into has led to an argument. I have had the most aggressive, hostile, angry, and dangerous taxi drivers I have ever encountered anywhere in the world on Malta. What is it with these guys? What are they having with their breakfast tea that puts them in such a foul mood or is it something I've said, something I've done? So as I had the third or fourth row trying actually to get into this very compound where we are now, a sort of story began to pop into my head. Supposing we have a tourist who is visiting Malta with his family and who goes by himself in a taxi and has an altercation on the road with a taxi driver, as we did this morning trying to get back to the hotel, and they step out of a taxi somewhere where there isn't too much buildings or too much, and they have a row, and in the course of this row, one of them kills the other. And I thought, what if the tourist, as I was feeling right then, kills the taxi driver? And then then what happens next? What then happens? Supposing this tourist decides that the only thing he can do is to stay in Malta for 4 days. In 4 days' time, he has a flight out of the country. And he decides the best thing to do is to stick with the flight out of Malta, because if he tries to get in earlier and runs to the airport straight away, the police might find him. So he decides he will spend the next 4 days in the tourist group doing tourism in Malta with this secret in his head. He's just murdered a taxi driver. And then the other main character will be a Maltese police officer who is closing in on what happened and getting more and more clues. And so what you've got suddenly is an interesting book. I'm not sure anybody has written a murder mystery that takes place over 4 days with a clock ticking until the flight. And the big question of the book, the tension of the book, is will this tourist be able to get on the plane before the detective stops him and arrests him? And do we want him to get away with it? Do we feel that he deserves to get away? So there is a sort of I'm not saying I'm going to write this idea incidentally. I'm merely saying that this is how I live my life, that every single incident that happens suggests a story to me. And I'll go further than that and say that what I get when I'm walking around the world is a sort of a domino effect. What I just told you there is a first domino. Two people, a tourist and a taxi driver, have an argument and one kills the other. Plonk. Now, this first domino, you may have seen this on television where you have not one, but 1,000 dominoes, and they're all in a long, long line. Have you seen this done on some children's TV shows? One knocks the other, knocks the other, knocks the other, and then they spread out and they go up and then the camera goes up in the air and it shows a giant picture formed by all these falling dominoes. That, to me, is what it is to write a novel. The novel is the picture formed by all these falling dominoes. And that is what I do every single day. And sometimes an idea will have only 1 or 2 dominoes and it won't take me anywhere. I'm not sure that taxi driver story I've told you has got enough dominoes in it really for a whole novel. But it might do. If not, if it's only got a few dominoes, it's a short story. So that is how I begin my ideas. But now I want to move on from that to the reality of creating this book and how I went about it. Just so I know instantly, has anybody in this room read Close to Death? So a few hands going up. I will not therefore reveal who did it in this talk. I will try and avoid that particular thing. This novel came about because I'm in a different sphere now, obviously. As a writer who's been around for a long time, I tend to be able to jump in and get published fairly easily. My publishers are always asking me for new books. Do I have some water here? Let me just grab this. And about 8 or 9 years ago, my new publishers, Penguin Random House, asked me to write not one, but a series of detective novels. Now, I have to tell you that in the world of publishing and writing, the series is something of the sort of the golden fleece. It's what everybody is searching for, the lost ark, if you like. Because if you can create a Rebus, a Morse, a Sherlock Holmes, a James Bond, a character who can go on for 1, 2, 3, for many, many books, you are doing something which is what all publishers love. You are creating something which the audience recognizes, and therefore they will always, when Ian Rankin produces a new Rebus novel, people will buy it because they love that character and want to know what's going to happen to him next. There are now, I think, 26 or more Rebus novels, so with each one, you want to find out what happens as a result of what happened in the last book. And that's what Ian does with his books. He keeps developing the character. Also, from the point of view of a writer, if you have one character, I've created 14 Alex Rider novels, for example. The more you write a character, the more you get to know him, the more you understand him, the more there is to discover in that character. I see you nodding, Simon, in the front row there. Simon has written 4 books about the same character, and therefore also, that's not Simon, is it? It's Mark. Am I right? Mark. I'm sorry, I've met so many new people today, all named after apostles of one sort or another. But 4 books have one character. With each book, you get to know more about the character and therefore have more to write. So I was asked, would I do a new detective series? And so I don't need to think, what's the idea going to be? Because the idea has already been given to me. But this time I have to think, what do you think? Where would you start if you were asked to write a series, a long-running murder mystery series that was going to have the same character in it throughout? Where would you begin? The backstory of who? Sorry, I don't know quite who you're talking about. Of which character? The detective. That's where you begin. Of course, if you're going to Sherlock Holmes is famous for many things, but of course everybody knows Sherlock Holmes first and foremost. Most people don't read murder mysteries because of the villain or the killer, although the genius of Arthur Conan Doyle was to create one of the greatest villains in literature, although actually James Moriarty, only appears in 2 stories and almost nothing is known about him. He is famous because he's invisible and we know nothing about him. That was part of his genius. But for most people like me, the most important thing in a detective series is the detective, or so I thought. Penguin Random House wanted me to write maybe 5, 6, 7, or even, as it turns out, 12 books about this character about whom I know nothing. So I start asking myself questions about who this detective might be. Is he going to be fat or thin? Old or young? Gay or straight? Male or female? Black or white? Asian, maybe? Could he be disabled, drunk, divorced, depressed, disgusting, diseased, deceased? How about an alien detective, or a robot detective, or even a detective who is an animal, a cat, let us say? And very quickly, having asked this question, I discovered something rather shocking. Everything has been done. They all exist. If you want a disabled detective, there's Ironside. Anyone remember that old TV series, Detective in a Wheelchair? If you want a detective who is diseased, Dennis Potter did a thing called The Singing Detective, with a detective with a horrible skin disease. A deceased detective, Randall and Hopkirk, deceased. Randall Hopkirk is a ghost who helps his partner. A vampire detective, believe it or not, there's a Korean TV series made in 2016. An alien detective, there was Alien Nation. Some of you may have seen a TV series that came out in 1989, produced by Fox. How about a robot detective? Well, there's one of those too, a superhero series from Japan in 1973, and a cat detective. How about a detective who's a cat? That's an original idea. No, it isn't. Tony the Cat Detective is one. The Cat Who Solved 3 Murders is another. Justin Cat Detective is yet another. The Magical Cats Mysteries. Anyone read that out of interest? I haven't either. Do you know there are 23 cat detectives listed on Google? And you realize, look, writers can do what has already been done. Of course you can repeat what other people have done, but to me, innovation, doing new things, finding new grounds is to me the entire purpose of being a writer. Writing, I've always said, is an adventure. You want to go to places that no one has been before. So having thought about what the detective would be in this long-running detective series, I began to realize I was asking the wrong question, but that question had already been asked and already been answered. So instead I began to look at the whole structure and the way that detective novels work, searching for a way of doing things in a completely different fashion. So I began to think about the relationship of the 3 most important people in a detective novel. And they are, effectively, the author, let us say Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the detective, Sherlock Holmes, and the sidekick. The sidekick being Dr. Watson. Of course, the reason why Conan Doyle is the great-grandfather of all modern detective fiction is that he was the person who first created that triangle which everybody else follows. With Agatha Christie, it's Poirot, who is the detective, Agatha Christie, who is the genius on the hillside. Don't forget that the most clever person in a detective novel is the writer, because the writer knows who the killer is even before the murder has been committed, because the writer knows everything. The writer is God. And then you've got next door to Poirot, you've got Hastings. And the sidekick is immensely useful because the sidekick knows nothing. The sidekick is effectively quite stupid. Hastings is not stupid next door. No, Hastings is very stupid. But Watson, who is the sidekick of Holmes, is actually quite an intelligent man, but nonetheless, he's on the same level as the reader. And I began to think about that relationship. The writer who knows everything, the detective who is his puppet, and the sidekick who knows nothing. And I thought, well, what if you swapped them round? Supposing the author, instead of being on the top of the hill, dropped down into the novel and became the narrator, which, if you think about it, is exactly what Watson is. Who is writing the Sherlock Holmes stories? In every single story, apart from 1 or 2, it is Watson who is telling the story. He is the narrator, but he is actually Conan Doyle, but just with a different voice. So I thought, well, instead of me being the author, what happens if I put myself in the book and make myself the sidekick? So instead of being the cleverest person, I'm the stupidest person. Are you following me in all this? Because then suddenly the whole premise of the book has changed. Hawthorne is a private detective solving crimes. He hires, the story is he needs money. He's not earning enough money as a detective, so he goes to a writer to write about him, and the idea is they will split the profits of the book 50-50. And the writer that he goes to is me, not a fake me, but the real me. Me who is busy writing Foyle's War and doing other TV shows, and who hasn't got time for him, but is nonetheless arm-twisted into writing these stories, and so becomes the sidekick to him. We have a very difficult and uneasy relationship. Hawthorne is very rude to me. He is very cynical about my abilities. And the worst thing about him, he has some very, very unpolitically correct ideas, politically incorrect ideas, which I find very difficult to live with. But the worst thing is he calls me Tony. I hate being called Tony. My name is Anthony, if anyone wants to ask questions in a minute. But anyway, he calls me Tony, and we have this very fractious relationship. But here's the thing. If he doesn't solve the crime, I don't have a book. I live in these books in terror that he will fail, but I'll write 120,000 words, but won't have a final chapter. And the other thing about him is that I don't know what to describe. If I'm Conan Doyle, I'm the author on the hill, I know that it's important to mention this, the fingerprints on the windowsill or the ash in the ashtray. But because I don't know what on earth is going on, I just have to take potluck about what I describe in the book. So what you have here is, I hope, a completely original and different sort of whodunit. And that's, to me, what the whole craft of writing is about. It is finding new ways to do things that have been done many, many times before. Now, having come up with him, my next thought was, effectively, what sort of crimes would we be working on together? This wasn't really a big decision to make, because what sort of crimes are there in the world? I mean, there are cold cases, there are murders that happened 15, 20 years ago, which you can then try and solve. There are loads and loads of books of them. There are serial killer stories. Serial killers, incidentally, make very, very bad subjects in murder mystery. They're great in books like The Silence of the Lambs and other books like that, although Thomas Harris, I think, really did corner the market in serial killers. But serial killers as sort of suspects in a murder story, you cannot get to the end of a clever whodunit and say he did it because he was crazy and liked killing people. It won't work, I don't think. So that's certainly not in my sort of crime. So serial killers weren't of great interest to me. I did think at one stage the Hawthorne and I might solve wills. My wife and I, Jill Green and I, had worked for years and years on a TV series called Where There's a Will, which looked at simply people leaving money to other people and then dying, which of course is a perfect recipe for a murder mystery story. How did they die? Did they fall? Were they pushed? Sort of thing. But we got close to making it, but never did. But still, that idea, maybe a story all about wills. But the truth is that with Hawthorne, I knew at once that we could do any sort of crime we wanted, because we already had the core idea, which was that I was going to be the sidekick. And then we come to the other thing aside is, was this going to be the world of Agatha Christie or the world of police sort of drama, serious police drama, maybe your sort of drama? Because that's a very big question for me. You know, Agatha Christie is a genius, but her stories are, shall we say, a touch on the unrealistic side. I mean, apart from the fact that they have butlers and actresses and bishops and writers and explorers and retired colonels, and they belong to a slightly strange world, they are, as it were, heightened writing. They're not the real world. I could have written more like Ian Rankin and put it into a sort of the true gritty crime stuff, but that's not me. I actually made the conscious decision that I feel more comfortable away from reality, because the world I inhabit is the world of what is called intellectual crime, armchair crime, golden crime. The only description I never use is cozy crime, because to me, cozy crime, although it's bandied around a great deal, is quite a sort of to me, it's a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing as a cozy crime. You cannot be stabbed cozily or shot cozily. You need to be, and I've always thought that even in the Hawthorne novels, death and murder is taken seriously because it is a serious business. So having decided on that, I started to write these books, and I wrote 5 books, or at least there are now 5 books. They are The Word is Murder, The Sentence is Death, A Line to Kill, The Twist of a Knife, and the one I'm talking about, or meant to be talking about now, Close to Death. Now, you may have noticed from those titles, incidentally, that my original idea when I set out on this series was that every book would have some word in it that was connected to writing, because these are sort of about writing. So I started with the word is murder, then I went with the sentence is death, a line to kill is a bit weak, but sort of gets there, the twist of a knife hopeless, and close to death fails too. And I realized very quickly that I'd actually run out after 3 books of titles that I could use. I did have an idea for one other book, which is going to be set in a mortuary somewhere where a body is stolen, or rather a part of a body is stolen, the colon is torn out, and the title was going to be The Colon is Missing. But that one I haven't done. Anyway, that will be number 6 if I were to do it. So instead, I came upon this book, Close to Death. Now, when I wrote this book, and when I write any book, I think I've talked about needing an idea, but I've got the idea. The idea is that Hawthorne and I will solve a murder, or rather he'll solve a murder, and I'll be left bamboozled 10 steps behind him. But the first question I have to ask myself when I'm writing a murder mystery now is, what is the milieu? I don't know if you know this word, milieu. But it's an interesting word for me because it sort of suggests lots of things. It suggests not just where is the book taking place, Malta perhaps, or the south of France, or my next one in this series is going to be set in the south of France, actually, in Nice. But the milieu is also about, what is the book going to be about? What am I writing about? Why am I even writing this book? And this is something I would say if there were only 10 or 15 of you in this room, to each and every one of you. I would say never underestimate how long the journey is when you're writing a book. You know, it is probably 8 or 9 months of writing. Shall we say 2 or 3 or 4 months of thinking and structuring? I'll come to that in a minute. But then there's another whole year of it being published, and then having to go out and sell the book, and having to talk about the book, and write articles about the book, and be interviewed about the book if you are so lucky. And that, therefore, is going to be 2 years of your life. So when you begin writing a book, even if it's only an entertainment, a murder mystery, surely to goodness you've got to write about something. What is the milieu going to be? What is it you actually want to write about? Is there some way you can inject into this book how you see the world, how you feel about the world, something that you want to say about politics, about the environment, about education, about reading itself? And this is something I've done in every single one of my books. For example, The Twist of a Knife is a book about theatre. It's about a particularly vicious theatre critic, a lady whose name for the moment escapes me, who gives a criticism of one of my plays. And I've wanted to write about this because it did happen. I wrote a play. I've actually written 2 plays, which I can tell you divided the critics in the United Kingdom, where these plays were performed in the West End, and the critics were split absolutely 50-50, what was called mixed reaction. Half of them hated my plays, and half of them loathed my plays. So by and large, it was an extremely unhappy experience for me, but that was something to write about. It gave me the pleasure of, A, having my revenge by creating this absolutely awful. Her name was Harriet Throsby, and I loved creating her, and I loved murdering her, for that matter, as well. Not that I have any great animus against critics. Critics are only doing a job. But nonetheless, it was a pleasure to write it, and it allowed me to look at the world of what it's like to be a critic. One of the suspects in that book was her husband, who wanted to murder her because she was always criticizing him. That's the wrong tie to be wearing. Oh, this tea's not warm enough. You know, you're late. When are you going to get going? Oh, my goodness, your hair, you're not getting... You know, that sort of wife. I'm happily not married to one, but that was the milieu. It was the reason to write the book. So when I started on Close to Death, number 5 in the series, and I'd already done one set on a small island, an island much smaller even than Malta. A Line to Kill is about a literary festival. I actually went to it on the island of Alderney, and when I went there, the moment I arrived at Alderney, I knew, in that moment I said about ideas coming into your head. The first thing that happened to me when I went to visit Alderney was that somebody who was showing me around said, you know, Anthony, there hasn't been a murder on this island for 1,000 years. And I thought, right, there's going to be one now. First thing, that's how ideas come, and indeed it is about a murder on the island of Alderney. It also allowed me to have a little bit of fun about literary festivals. I go to them all over the world. I do love going to them. I always enjoy them. But here were a bunch of really, really eclectic and odd writers writers. There's a pretentious poet, a very jolly cookery writer, a blind psychic who writes one of those books about, the afterlife and all that sort of stuff. And that just gave me the pleasure of writing about something I know a great deal about. A little lesson to you. Again, I'm not going to, because there are so many published writers here, I'm not going to stand here. And indeed, I've forgotten to say the one thing I should have started with at the very beginning of this talk. So if you will just forget for a moment everything I've been saying for the last 25 minutes, just remember this. My favorite quotation by one of the greatest writers of all time, William Goldman, who wrote a book, Adventures in the Screen Trade. Nobody knows anything. So I'm talking about my experiences and my life and my work, but nobody knows anything. What do I really know at the end of the day? Take what I say with a pinch of salt or write it down and think about it. That's your choice. Anyway, when I came to write this book, Close to Death, I had just moved into a place called Richmond, on the southwest side of London. Now, Richmond, for those of you who don't know it, forgive me. Richmond, for those of you who don't know it, is a sort of suburb. It's on the River Thames. It's very beautiful. There are a lot of very wealthy people who live there. And walking my dog around there, I noticed that there was a close. And you couldn't get into this close, a sort of a little fenced-off enclave of houses, because there was a gate across it. And I thought to myself, wow, that is a perfect milieu, a perfect environment for a murder story. In England, I don't know about Malta, I don't know if any of you live next door to a taxi driver, but we have a huge amount of stories and press activity about nightmare neighbours and difficulties between neighbours. And I should also say that when I was writing this story, the fact that I had moved to Richmond was a huge help to me, because I believe that it is always sensible to write about what you know. You can use Google Earth, you can use Wikipedia, you can talk to people who've been to places, you can look at films set in places, but it is so much easier and more entertaining for yourself to write about somewhere that you know, somewhere that you have been. I was now living in Richmond, and as I say, round the corner from where I lived, there was this enclave of houses behind a gate. And I used to walk past with my dog, another little point incidentally, which I would, if there were only 15 of you, would say, a dog is a great thing for a writer to have. My wife bought me my first dog when we'd just been married, I think, for 6 months, and she came into the room with a little pet Labrador, put it on my desk and said, here's a piece of exercise equipment you cannot ignore. And the point is absolutely true. I spend 10 hours a day behind a computer. I need to get out and have exercise. A dog is a wonderful thing. Walking with my dog, I pass this gate. And I want to know what's on the other side. What are these houses like? I used to go there and I would stand there for 10, 20, 30 minutes with this dog, waiting for the gate to open so I could slip in. It never did, but eventually I managed to find somebody who knew somebody who lived there. And if you want to know what this place looked like, go onto Google search and look up River Lane, Drum House, and the famous architect Terry Farrell, Farrell. And behind that gate were 6 of the most amazing houses I have ever seen. They were modernistic, sleek. They were glass and steel and cement. They had Japanese gardens. They were astonishingly beautiful. And I couldn't use them. Why? Anyone want to put a hand up and suggest? Yeah. No, every one of them was occupied. I didn't live with them. I don't want to tell people where I live, so I wouldn't put myself into a book that way anyway. I will tell you the answer. A detective story with a whole group of different people. To have one of these houses, you needed to have £5 million or more in your pocket. So everybody who lived there would be elevated, would be rich, would be more or less the same. They might be a rich architect, a rich actress, a rich whatever, lawyer, barrister, but they would all be of a certain class and type. An ethnicity, dare I say, still in the United Kingdom. Not necessarily, but possibly. And that was, to me, they were going to just be the houses were too smart. But then, fortunately, I met somebody who said, go across the road. And there, across the road, was another road called Ferry Road. And I went in there, and this was the same. It wasn't a gated community. You can just walk in and walk out. But of course, as a writer, I can immediately magic up the gates and make it a gated community. And this had houses that had different sizes, different things, and I could have different people living in it. And so I am doing a book, as I said, about nightmare neighbors. Now, I go on Wikipedia or Google or somewhere, and I discover that these are the biggest complaints you get in the United Kingdom about neighbors. Noise, parking, property, who owns what, who owns how much, what the boundaries are, overgrowing trees, children making too much noise. Now, any one of these can lead to murder. That's a great thing about living in the United Kingdom. Neighbors do really get under your skin if you let them. And so my immediate thought was this. I'm going to include every single one of these problems in my book, because these are, according to all the records, the main causes of upset: parking, property boundaries, overgrowing trees, noise, and children. So all of those are going to be up there, and somebody is going to kill a neighbor who is guilty of all of those crimes. But whatever the solution to the book is, it's not going to be any of those that actually matter. It'll be something else that you can't see. That's how I structure these books, because everybody's expecting it because of this, because of this, because of this, because of that. And nobody will notice over here, actually, it's because of something I've told you, but which you haven't seen. So now all I had to do was to people the book, because the next biggest challenge for me, and I'm sort of jumping forwards, because I'm looking at my watch, and I want to stop in about 8 minutes' time to allow for questions from you. And when I get to the end of this, possibly not, but I'll try and get as far as I can. Book and writing is about character. All stories depend upon character. People ask what comes first, the story or the character. For me, they come at more or less the same time. The characters have to carry the story. And you have to have characters, particularly in my sort of novel, we're talking about a crime novel here, that are both believable, people you would believe and accept are living in Richmond, but they can't be boring. They've got to be interesting. You've got to be hooked by these people. And so these are the people that I decided on having in this close. It took me, I think, longer to come up with these characters than anything else in the book. But if I listen them very quickly for you, I'm going to give you an idea of how I think. I started with the villain. His name is Giles Kenworthy. Now, let me just give you a quick word about names. A name is the first thing you learn about somebody. You know, when you have a grandchild, I've just had a grandchild myself, and they told me the name was Cosima. And I thought, well, yeah, I love that name, I suppose. But that's the first thing I know about this little girl. Anyone I meet in this room, the first thing I will learn about you is your name. Names are so important. My favorite author, Charles Dickens, came up with the most wonderful names. If you want a teacher who you don't want to come across if you are a student, call him Wackford Squeers. You sort of know that is not a teacher you ought to be taught by. Dickens took it too far, but even his heroes, David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby, they have names that make you think, oh, I'd like this guy, I want to meet him. Uriah Heep? No thanks. So names are quite interesting, exciting. Giles Kenworthy. It's not a ridiculous name, but somehow there's something about that just to me, the Kenworthy, I don't know. When I then add that he's a hedge fund manager, well, I hate him already. I understand that he's an old Etonian. Great, that's great. He has two very, very noisy kids, one of the things I need. He also has 4 cars. He's got a Mercedes, a Mini Coupe, a Pontiac Le Mans Cabriolet, and a Porsche Boxer with his own initials as a number plate, COK 999, Cock 999 as it is. And, you know, even in this little tiny cartoonish thing, I've created a man who does deserve to die. And then I sort of start thinking about his people around him, because that's a great thing. A murder mystery is a bullseye. The bullseye is the murder. Somebody is killed by somebody else for a reason. And all I'm doing now is I'm building around that bullseye all the different people who might have killed him, who might be associated with him. In this book, they're all his neighbors. One is his wife, Linda with a Y. She met him on a long-distance flight. She's an air hostess. But then again, my job is not to caricature that sort of person, to say just because she began life as a job as a British Airways air stewardess, or whatever it is you're meant to call them now, air attendant, she turns out to be very bright, very intelligent, very charming, and very, very attractive. So I don't go for caricature. I have to avoid that. That's sort of a crime in a book in itself. Next door to them, the neighbours to the right, Roderick Brown. He's a dentist. Perfectly reasonable for a dentist to be there. But that's not interesting enough, is it? A man is a dentist. End of story. So I make him a celebrity dentist. And he's very, very proud of the fact that for a short while, the actor Ewan McGregor was one of his clients. And suddenly you begin to see this man who is so pleased that he knows the inside of Ewan McGregor's mouth. He's actually based, incidentally, on my own dentist, who is a celebrity dentist. That's not his name, but it's always much easier to draw characters from the people you know and people you read about than to create them from scratch. His wife, Felicity Brown, is suffering from ME, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is actually a horrible illness. It wears you out, it exhausts you. So into this world of fantasy and sort of silliness, I've now got something I can write about with a bit of sympathy and sadness. This woman has only got one thing in her life, which is a view out of her window, which goes down to the River Thames over a garden. And Giles Kenworthy wants to build a swimming pool in front of her house, destroying her view. So that's a reason for Roderick Brown to kill him. These people you see all have reasons to kill him as well as lives of their own. Linda Kenworthy, for example, is having an affair with a tennis coach, so that's her reason to want to kill him. Next door, May Winslow and Phyllis Moore, two retired nuns who run a bookshop in Richmond itself. That's a little bit outre, a little bit fantastical, but they are based on people I know. When I was a boy at my house when I was 8 years old, we had a cook and a maid, and their names were Phyllis and May. That's where the two characters come from. And they run a little bookshop called the Tea Cozy in Richmond, which only publishes books that aren't violent, which allows me, the milieu, to write about what I love writing about, which is cozy crime. That's what they're selling, is they only sell cozy crime in the Tea Cozy. They wouldn't stop me, and I can have a little laugh at the types of books they write, particularly when it turns out at the end that they both brutally murdered their husbands. So that's a sort of the little joke built in there, and a little spoiler for you if you ever read the book. However, then there's Andrew Pennington, a black barrister. He's living in this close too. And that allows me, I have a very good friend who is one of the most successful black barristers in the country. He told me a terrible story about how his entire career had been a fight against racism and against, people wanting him to fail because of his color or not giving him the jobs he wanted. I could not believe that in the 21st century, and in the Great Britain, which prides itself on its sort of multiculturalism, that sort of attitude still existed. So it was wonderful to put him into the book and to write in his words, the words, that is, of my friend, Harry, what this man was thinking, to be able to highlight something that matters. This is a whodunit. It's disposable. You're going to read it and forget it. But maybe, in the course of writing it, I can put something in which is worthwhile and worth having and worth remembering. And that was, I suppose, one of the main things. Then there's Adam Strauss, who is a chess grandmaster fallen on hard times. Loved writing about him. I'd loved imagining what it must be like to be a chess grandmaster. And he's a chess grandmaster who's fallen on rather hard times. There was a time when he was famous with a TV show, a quiz show, called It's Your Move. And I remember when I thought that up, I immediately knew this sad man. Who, for God's sake, would watch a quiz show, a chess-based quiz show called It's Your Move? It's pathetic. And I love the fact that he's great, he's a grand master, that's his name. He's the greatest chess player in the country, and yet he has fallen to that sort of level. And he was fun to write. And one other character I'll go on about, Tom Beresford, an NHS doctor who's having a breakdown because of his of the amount of work he's got to do. Giles Kenworthy, his neighbour, parked a car across his drive, and he was unable to get to the surgery in time to stop one of his patients, an elderly gentleman, from having a fatal heart attack. And he blames Giles Kenworthy for that, and that's his motive for doing the crime. So that's a good story from the point of view of the crime, but it's also, for me, as I create that character, something else I want to write about, because, of course, in Great Britain, we all talk about the NHS endlessly. We want to support it. We know very well that the doctors, particularly the junior doctors, are under enormous stress, and so therefore that's another added plus to put into the book. Now, I've been talking fast, and I'm about to stop, and I know if I ever do this talk again that I need 2 hours to do it in, not 1 hour to do it in, but I hope that in this sort of rather rushed and brief way, I've managed to give you an idea of the workings of the writer's mind. That's all I can actually do here. I haven't talked about structure, how I spend 3 months or 4 months structuring every single book I write. Sometimes it takes me longer to structure a book than to write the book. But I'm not standing here either and saying to you as writers, as fellow writers, as would-be writers, you should all structure your book, because some of the best writers I know don't. Ian Rankin has told me that when he writes a book, he just has an idea and begins to write and sees where it goes. I'd recommend a book to you by an author to you called Liz Nugent, who I'm very fond of. Liz Nugent has written 2 wonderful books called crime books. One is called Strange Sally Diamond. The other are Little Cruelties. She comes up with a sentence. A sentence falls into her head, and she starts writing. And again, she doesn't know where it's going to go. She tells me, but she still writes absolutely wonderful books. And Don Winslow, again, one of the greatest crime writers on the planet, who sadly gave up writing books in order to focus on fighting the last election and supporting the Democrats. I'm afraid that didn't go too well for him. But he also, I read a book of short stories of his called Broken. They are masterpieces of construction. I said to him, because I knew him, I said, how did you structure them? How did you do it? He said, I just started writing and I wrote them. So you don't have to structure, but I do. I think that when you're writing a book is a foreign country. If I come to Malta and I don't have a map of Malta, and I come here for the first time, how am I going to find my way to St. John's Cathedral? How am I going to decide to do St. John's Cathedral in the morning and then do a harbour tour in the afternoon? Because I need to know how near they are to each other. But having a map doesn't mean I have to start at St. John's and then go to the harbour. I can go anywhere. A map doesn't constrain you. A map opens up the landscape in which you're writing. That's why I like a structure. And I like to surprise myself sometimes. I think if you don't surprise yourself, how will you surprise your readers? And often I will go offbeat. I'll get to chapter 7 and take a completely different direction. The structure allows me to come back to where I'm meant to be, to realize I've got to find a way back to point number 8 in the structure to continue my story forward. So that's a few words on structure. I was going to talk about the opening and the cover. I don't have time. I could talk about the writing process. You don't need to know that. I'm looking at my watch and I'm seeing 8:20. So I'm going to just say the 5 pieces of advice I get asked by young writers. And I'm going to finish on this note, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, which, we can stay here for longer than an hour if you wish, but if you don't, I'm at least not going to be accused of going over the limit that I was given. I'm often asked, what are the 5 pieces of advice that I would give young people, to children? And I always start by saying, and it's true for adults too, I think, read. If you don't read, how can you possibly write? I love reading. My influence is Charles Dickens, who I adore and have adored all my life. That mixture of humor and social statement and twists and turns and surprises and violence. There is nobody like him still, I think. And I love Dickens with a passion. I've read all his books 4 times, and every time I read the books, I learn something new about myself. And I think that's the greatest thing about great literature. It's not that the books change, but you do. And the books reflect that change. So now when I last read it, I was shocked by some of the way he treats women, for example. That never occurred to me when I was in my 20s. But now I can see it. And of course, it's true of his life as well. So that's the first thing, is read. The second piece of advice, write. Little and often. Don't sit and stare at a blank sheet of paper. If you sit and stare in a room at a blank sheet of paper, all you will do is drive yourself mad. Go out and do things. You need to do that. This is the advice I give to children. Go out, have adventures, do something illegal, don't get caught. Because that way, at least if you live life on the edge, which I have done, I've done bad things and wicked things, and I've done crazy things, they've all been grist to the writer's mill. And particularly when you get to be a successful writer, you don't know how many hours you are going to spend in that room by yourself. I often say that the only difference between a successful writer and an unsuccessful writer is that the room gets bigger. That's the thing. I've got a slightly bigger room than I had when I started, but I'm still stuck in it by myself with the dog day in, day out, although I do love what I do. That's 3 pieces of advice. 4th is, people say to me, is it difficult doing this? Is it difficult doing that? Never use that word is my advice. Because I think if it's difficult, if it's problematical, if you ask yourself a question of why a character is doing something and the answer is difficult, something has gone wrong. I think that writing is like flow and immersion and getting into the story and going where it takes you. Yes, with a structure, yes, with notes, yes, with planning and thinking and all the rest of it. But the actual writing itself should be easy and immersive and fun. And I love writing. I use fountain pens, by the way, not computers. Second draft computer. I love fountain pens. Why? I love being close to the paper. I love writing without Bill Gates or Elon Musk or anybody else between me and my work. I love the flow of ink. Writers are united all over the world. Our blood is blue, the color we use to write ink, and it connects me with the great writers, Dickens and Hardy and Austen and all these other great writers. What is it they wrote with? Ink. And so that to me is something that I always like to do in my work. And the last piece of advice, which I will leave you with before I open this up to questions from the floor. It is the most difficult thing in the world, but it's to believe in yourself. It is we as writers live endlessly in fear of being found out that we are no good, that all our work is actually rubbish. I have often described my life as being like that character in a Wile E. Coyote film. The Roadrunner films. I'm that character who is running along a bridge, and the bridge is burning behind me as I go, and the only problem I'll have is if I stop and look round. Then I'll see the bridge is gone, and I'll fall to my death in the chasm. Keep going forward, keep believing in yourself. Don't listen to whatever anybody says about your work, unless you are getting constructive and helpful criticism from an agent, from a friend, whatever. But self-belief is the toughest thing of all, I think, to acquire and to keep as a writer. And even now, even in this late day when I'm sold, the books that I've sold and the position that I have and I get invited to a festival like this, I can tell you when I'm writing a book, it's a work of genius. It is the greatest book ever written since the Bible. When I write the end and I stop writing a book, it is a piece of rubbish. It is garbage. It's awful. My editor's going to hate it. My publisher's going to hate it. My agent will lie about it and say it's great, but everybody else, it's hopeless. And then there's that slow climb to publication, and will it succeed, won't it succeed? And in a sense, at the end of it, it wasn't the greatest piece of work that was ever written. It wasn't the worst. It was something in between. But self-belief, God knows, it's been my fuel now for 35 years of writing, and it's all really that I have left. And on that rather rushed note, knowing next time what I have to do to get to the end of the speech without missing out chunks in the middle, I'm going to stop and ask you if there are any questions and answers from this audience. Sir. We don't need the mic. We don't need it. We're having it.
At what time do you know the major clue that will reveal the murder? Before you start writing? And what comes first, the clue or the character?
Very, very good question. Did everybody hear it? Because you had a microphone, so you could. They come at the same time. In the clues, I talked about the structure. I have a notebook. I don't do post-it notes on the wall. I have a book. And in the book, I write clues. I underline it, and on that page, I write the clues I'm going to put in. And I believe that the clues should always be in plain sight. They should always, when you get to the end of an Agatha Christie book, you never, ever feel cheated. You always feel that you could have guessed it. I sometimes watch television shows on British TV when there was no chance of guessing who did it. And I get so annoyed. There have to be clues people can see. Now, in the book I've just finished, one of the characters has been created with a missing eye, and very bad facial injuries, and an arm that won't move, because he went through a red light. And that is the clue to how the murder was committed. I'm not going to say if he lives or dies, if he's the victim or the killer or just a suspect, but that in itself, the character I knew was going to be this person who had these injuries. Now, that's not his entire character, but that is what he has to be for the book to work. And that's often the case with me, that if I look at this one here, when I describe to you the different characters living in this close in the book, this book Close to Death, I actually told you who the killer was amongst those characters, and I also described what it was that would lead him to be the obvious killer, or her, one or the other. But I'm not going to say, because I don't want to spoil the ending, but the nature of that character and the fact that she was the killer were sort of born at the same moment. And the book actually, the entire book, rests on this strange quirk of character, which could be the doctor who who is drinking and because a drunken doctor is obviously in a good position to kill because he's surrounded, or she is surrounded by all the the equipment you need. Or it could have been, I don't know who I mentioned in that book, but nonetheless, one of them. They come together, and I'm always looking for new and interesting clues that haven't been done before. It's not good enough, I think, to have left something behind, or to have made a mistake, or to whatever. It is something that that, you know, it's not like a torn piece of a letter or a fingerprint or anything like that. It's got to be something that is special and different. The two come at the same time. Yeah.
First of all, I just want to give you enormous praise for the Susan Ryland books, which I think are absolutely extraordinary. And in terms of innovating in the genre in which in mystery and detective and thriller, they're absolutely extraordinary. I have two questions relating from Moonflower Murders. One of the very specific ones, there's a TV series on at the moment. In Moonflower Murders, the Bert Lahr issue comes up, which the Wizard of Oz, the Friendly Lion,
Oh, yes.
Cowardly Lion. That issue of bringing in real-life personalities, real-life people, there's even a reference, Matthew Pritchett pops up in Magpie. Has that ever become an issue? Because Susan Ryland says to Alan Conway, oops, I'm not so sure about this mixture of real and fictional. Is that a real agenting / publishing stricture / warning about not to mix the two worlds?
I'll answer your first question before I come to the second question you have. I take it you all heard that. I am interested in exploring. I said at the beginning of this talk, but I'm interested in doing things that have never been done before, new things that... The gentleman has a second question. I'll get it anyway without the mic. I'm fascinated by the break between reality and fiction. I'm always exploring, for example, why is it that if there is a dead body lying outside this tent when we leave tonight, we'll be shocked and horrified? If there is a murder in Malta, if there is if somebody is killed tonight in the streets of Valletta, we'll read about it in the papers tomorrow. We'll all be a little disgusted. If it's in a book, we smile and we enjoy it. Why is this? What is it between reality and fiction that this transition happens? So I've become quite interested in putting in, and so you're quite right, in Magpie Murders, I decided very, very early on that I would have Matthew Pritchard turn up to provide a commentary in one chapter. I had lunch with him exactly as I described. And I've taken that much, much further in the Hawthorne Horowitz books, because I am myself real and I'm in these books. And so you have a complete divide. And I will say that one of the biggest issues I had, or worries I had, was in a chapter in that book where I'm having a meeting, and this meeting really did take place, with Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson, the two greatest film directors in the world, and me in a room. And in the book, what happens is Hawthorne knocks on the door, comes in, says a few words, and destroys my career with these two people. And when I wrote this, I was very, very worried.